unsolved. And I will love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life.
The air in the gardens of the Château de Vincennes was filled with the soft perfume of blooming roses. Laughter of children echoed faintly between the marble columns and neatly trimmed hedges. Among them ran a small girl, no more than 6 years old, her golden braids swaying as she clutched a doll carved from ivory. Her pale skin glimmered under the spring sun, and her large, curious blue eyes reflected the innocence of a childhood untouched by the brutal games of kings and crowns. But fate had already drawn its lines for her. Inside the grand halls of the chateau, French courtiers whispered beneath towering tapestries. Documents sealed with crimson wax lay across an oak table, and at its head sat her uncle, the King of France. Diplomats, priests, and noblemen leaned close together, voices hushed but tense. The child playing in the gardens was no longer just a daughter, a sister, a girl. She was a pawn in the political chessboard of Europe. England and France were locked in an uneasy dance of rivalry and alliance. To bind the two crowns, it had been decided. The 6-year-old French princess would be married to the 29-year-old King of England. It was not love, nor even friendship. It was strategy, written in blood and ink. That evening, as the bells of the chapel tolled softly, the young girl was led into a vast hall glittering with candlelight. Her tiny hand clutched the silken folds of her nurse's gown. The nobles bowed deeply, their eyes sharp with calculation rather than affection. Before her stood the English envoys, resplendent in heavy cloaks embroidered with golden lions. One knelt and presented a jeweled ring, not a gift of affection, but a contract of power. The princess did not understand. To her, the hall seemed strange and frightening, the voices too loud, the faces too serious. She whispered to her nurse in French, asking when she could return to the gardens. But the nurse only tightened her grip, offering a strained smile. Childhood was slipping away with every passing moment. Later that night, as the chateau grew quiet, the girl sat by the window in her small chamber. The moonlight touched her delicate features, and in the distance, she heard the murmurs of men discussing her future. A future she had no say in. For the first time, she felt the weight of something she could not name: destiny. The following weeks were a blur of preparation. Tutors drilled her on English phrases she could barely pronounce. Seamstresses measured her for gowns woven with gold thread and rare silk. Priests instructed her on the sacred duties of queenship. She was no longer treated as a child, but as a symbol, a living treaty bound by divine will and political necessity. On the day of the betrothal, the cathedral was ablaze with light. Stained glass windows painted the marble floors in shades of crimson and sapphire. Incense hung thick in the air, mingling with the murmured prayers of bishops and noblewomen alike. The little princess, dressed in a white silk gown embroidered with golden lilies, walked slowly down the aisle. Her tiny steps echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling as hundreds of eyes watched her, measuring her value in alliances and armies. At the altar, she stood beside a portrait of her future husband, the King of England, a man she had never met, nearly 5 times her age. The contrast was almost cruel. A child, crowned with innocence, promised to a world of power, expectation, and danger. And yet, beyond the grandeur and ritual, there was silence within her heart. She did not yet know the battles she would face, nor the storms her name would summon. All she knew was the weight of the golden circlet placed upon her head, and the soft, trembling words whispered by the priest. In the name of God, the crown, and the kingdom. In that moment, the 6-year-old princess became more than a child. She became England's queen-to-be, a symbol, a promise, and a prisoner of destiny. Morning broke like a page gilded at the edge. Bells rolled over the rooftops, and Westminster's great nave swelled with color, sapphire and carmine from the stained glass drifting across marble like slow water. The little princess stood at the threshold, a white silk mantle settling on her shoulders, as if it weighed a kingdom. Her braids, threaded with seed pearls, brushed the embroidered lilies at her collar. When she looked up, the vault seemed impossibly high, a stone sky held by forests of columns. Somewhere, a choir tested a single note and let it hang, perfect and fragile. This was not the ceremony of a child, though a child was at its center. Bishops in cloth of gold processed beneath fluttering banners. Envoys in fur-lined robes counted meanings behind every gesture. Heralds announced names that sounded like oaths. The English king, nearly 5 times her age, waited beneath the crossing's lantern, crimson mantle falling in ordered folds, a jeweled crown answering the light. His face was grave, carved by years of counsel and campaign. But when he inclined his head to her, the motion was careful, almost gentle, as though acknowledging a burden neither had chosen. Vows were spoken in voices that filled the stone, rings were lifted, gospel pages turned with reverent care, seals warmed over coals. The princess said the words taught to her the night before, syllables of another tongue set like bright stones in her small mouth. When the priest lowered the veil of gold-threaded gauze, the world softened at its edges, shapes blurred, sound hushed, and the breath she drew smelled of incense and beeswax and old parchment. She felt the light touch of a circlet and the warmer weight of a hand, ceremonial, precise, resting a heartbeat on her shoulder. In the benches, pens scratched as clerks captured history in ink. Outside, Paris thundered with pageantry. Trumpets shone, petals fell, a white destrier tossed its silvered bridle. The new bond was paraded like a relic. From the high seat of the state carriage, the princess watched the city flow past. Timbered overhangs, bright market canopies, faces lifted, faces turned away. The king rode beside her, flanked by knights whose armor answered the sun. To the crowd, they were an emblem. To her, the world felt both too large and too narrow, like a dress not yet broken in. The leave-taking was a seam ripped quickly. At Calais, the wind smelled of iron and brine. Gulls stitched white arcs across a pewter sky. She stepped aboard the king's great cog with her governess, her tutors, a small chapel's worth of relics, and a chest of books whose letters she had only begun to tame. Ropes groaned. Sailors shouted in a staccato litany. The quay slid backward like a pulled curtain. France receded. First a line, then a thought. The channel showed its teeth by afternoon. Deck planks rose and fell with a giant's breath. Sprays of cold salt freckled her veil. The governess steadied her, pressing a lavender pomander into her palm. Between prayers, whispered to steady stomachs and souls, the princess studied the ship's inner kingdom. Coils of hawser, barrels stenciled with marks she traced like puzzles, a compass needle stubbornly pointing where she could not yet see. At dawn, England arrived as a band of chalk and green, the cliffs catching pale light and throwing it back. Bells answered from the harbor, pennons cracked in the stronger wind. On the quay, a knot of courtiers waited in ordered colors, their bows rehearsed, their words already weighted. She descended the gangplank, step by careful step, the hem of her gown kissed by the tide, and stood beneath a sky that felt thinner, brighter, new. London received her with iron and stone, the tower's blunt grace, the bridge bristling with houses, the dark ribbon of the Thames busy with barges. Everything carried purpose. From a barge, trimmed in scarlet, she watched the city lean in to look at her. Apprentices craning from windows, fishwives stilled at their stalls, boys running the embankment until they lost their breath. Somewhere upriver, cathedral bells braided themselves into welcome. That evening, in rooms warmed by tapestries and perfumed rushes, she was presented to the household that would shape her days. Tutors with schedules, ladies with careful voices, officials with lists that never ended. Gifts were arrayed like arguments. Goblets, seed pearl girdles, books with painted margins, each with a message attached. When the door finally closed, the world felt quiet enough to hear the river's slow voice through the shutters. She opened a primer and traced a single English word, practiced until it held still beneath her hand. Tomorrow would bring ceremonies of precedence, audiences, a city to learn. Tonight, with sea salt still in her hair and a candle guttering low, she folded the page, pressed it flat, and understood this much. Childhood had not ended. It had been translated. The months that followed blurred into ceremony, study, and silence. The young queen walked through marble halls heavy with echoes, each footstep swallowed by the weight of centuries. Hampton Court, with its endless galleries and gardens cut like geometry into the earth, seemed more like a theater than a home. Wherever she turned, someone was watching. Ladies in waiting with folded hands, tutors correcting pronunciation, clerks recording her every appearance as though each glance carried the power of law. At only 6 years old, she bore a crown, but no agency. Her days were mapped by others. Dawn began with a soft knock and the ritual of dressing, layer upon layer of linen, silk, and velvet, until her slight frame disappeared beneath symbols of wealth. Her braids, threaded with seed pearls, were woven tighter now, her gowns stitched with the fleur-de-lis she had left behind. French still tumbled from her lips, and though she practiced English by candlelight, the words often slipped like fish from her grasp, sparking quiet laughter behind covered mouths. The king, 29 years old, loomed as both guardian and stranger. Their encounters were ceremonial, their conversations translated through intermediaries. To her, he was an emblem: heavy robes, a jeweled crown, the scent of myrrh and parchment. Yet the court murmured ceaselessly about succession, treaties, alliances sealed by her small hand. Every gesture she made became a statement, every silence a negotiation. Life within the palace was an intricate dance of power. At feasts, she sat on a raised dais beside the king, while nobles measured each other across polished tables. Servants moved like shadows, pouring sweet wine into chaste goblets, setting platters of roasted venison and sugared almonds beneath candlelight. Yet behind the music and laughter, she caught the edges of whispers, disputes over lands, titles, the fragile balance between England and France. Outside the great halls, her tutors shaped her into what England required. Hours vanished beneath illuminated manuscripts and Latin declensions. She traced the curves of strange letters until her hand cramped. Music lessons filled the afternoons. First a tentative psalm sung too softly, then melodies threaded with harpsichord notes, fragile as breath. She learned to curtsy without looking down, to bow her head just enough to honor bishops without lowering herself too far. But not everything was duty. In quiet corners of the garden, she would find a slice of childhood untouched by protocol. Among roses heavy with scent, she played with wooden dolls carved by a craftsman from Rouen, their tiny gowns mirroring her own. A sparrow once landed on her sleeve and stayed long enough for her to giggle, a sound that startled even her governess, who had almost forgotten how young she was. Still, the palace walls could not hide the realities pressing closer each day. Rumors from abroad arrived. One winter's evening, she overheard two chamberlains whispering by a brazier. Their voices were low, but she caught enough to understand. Her marriage was not a promise of love, but of strategy. If she failed to produce an heir one day, everything, her title, her safety, her place in this gilded world, could vanish as easily as wax beneath a flame. She retreated to her chambers, the weight of silk suddenly unbearable, and stared at her reflection in a polished silver mirror. The girl looking back at her had her mother's blue eyes, her father's jaw, and the crown's shadow already bending her posture. She whispered a single word in French, one she had practiced in English but never spoken aloud: freedom. It felt foreign in her mouth, yet sweet. The night outside was silent but for the distant tolling of bells. Inside, the young queen folded herself beneath layers of velvet, her dolls resting beside her like silent allies. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, treaties were being drafted and borders redrawn. Yet for the first time, she understood this much. She was both prize and pawn, adored and constrained, crowned yet captive. And as she drifted into sleep, the murmurs of the court seemed to weave into her dreams, reminding her that in England, power never truly rested. It shifted, like candlelight on cold stone. The years passed, but the palace remained a cage draped in silk. By the time the young queen turned 8, her days were no longer her own. Every moment was carefully scripted, every lesson, every glance rehearsed, until spontaneity became a forgotten luxury. The courtiers called her "Your Grace," but behind those smiles, power moved like a hidden current beneath the polished marble floors. The king, distant, ceremonial, more legend than husband, visited rarely. When he appeared, his presence commanded silence. Draped in crimson and gold, his laurel crown glinting beneath torchlight, he spoke little but watched everything. To him, she was a living treaty, her small figure binding 2 crowns together, her existence ensuring peace between France and England. To her, he was an untouchable figure carved from stone, a man she could neither know nor refuse. And yet, even as she grew into her role, whispers filled the corridors. Noble factions schemed in alcoves, their alliances shifting like sand underfoot. Every passing year made her more valuable and more vulnerable. At court, one misstep could mean ruin. A word spoken too loudly, a glance misread, a secret overheard. These were weapons sharper than any blade. Beneath the endless ceremony lay darker truths. In the shadows of Westminster, rival nobles gathered, each claiming influence over the girl queen's future. Some dreamed of unseating the king entirely, using her as their pawn. Others whispered of annulments, of remarriage, of leveraging her youth against her family's power in France. Her body, her title, even her silence, everything could be bartered in this unspoken game. Despite the weight of her crown, she was still a child. On spring mornings she wandered through hidden gardens, trailing her fingers along dew-covered leaves. Yet even there she was never truly alone. Guards stood at distant gates, and spies in servant's garb reported her every move. She once overheard a maid murmuring to another, "Pretty little dove, trapped in a golden cage." She said nothing, but the words rooted deep, their truth impossible to ignore. By 10, her education had become relentless. Latin, law, scripture, etiquette. Each day stretched beneath the burden of expectation. Tutors drilled her endlessly on diplomacy. When to smile, when to bow, when to speak and when to remain silent. She learned to read expressions the way others read scripture, memorizing the subtle dance of power. A lingering gaze could reveal a conspiracy, a trembling hand, a lie. And yet, the deeper she understood the court, the clearer its dangers became. Reports arrived daily from the countryside, unrest swelling in distant manors, rebellions whispered in taverns, taxes weighed heavily. That winter, an ominous shift swept through Westminster. A secret council convened behind closed doors, their meeting stretching long into the night. Servants whispered of intercepted letters, of a plot to remove the girl entirely, should France attempt to exert more control over England's throne. No one told her directly, but she saw the fear in her governess's eyes. heard the tightening edge in her tutor's voice. One night, unable to sleep, she crept to the edge of the royal gallery. There, beyond the latticed windows, she saw them. A gathering of high lords hunched beneath torchlight, their words lost beneath the clatter of distant hooves. But their faces were enough. Grim, calculating, hungry. In that moment, she understood. They were not her protectors. They were vultures, circling the promise of power. And so she began to play her part more carefully. Her curtsies grew deeper, her words more measured, her gaze more guarded. She smiled when expected, laughed on cue, and hid her thoughts behind lowered lashes. The court saw a compliant child, delicate and pliable. In truth, she was watching, listening, learning. Yet even her growing awareness could not shield her from the tightening web. Each passing year brought her closer to an unspoken destiny, one she had not chosen, one she could not escape. The crown glittered on her head, but beneath its weight lay chains invisible to the world. Far beyond the palace walls, the seeds of rebellion had already been sown. But within the heart of Westminster, a subtler war raged. A war of alliances and betrayals, fought not with swords, but with whispers. And at its center stood a child queen, crowned in gold, bound in silence, and haunted by a single truth. In this game, pawns rarely survived. By the time she turned 12, the little princess was gone. In her place stood a young queen, polished and poised, her childhood dissolved beneath layers of silk and protocol. To the world, she was the perfect image of grace, the girl who had been sent across the sea to unite two crowns. But behind her calm blue eyes, storms were gathering. The king was growing older, his health faltering under the weight of endless wars and political strife. Each passing season seemed to carve new lines into his face, and though his authority still loomed, his grip on the throne had begun to slip. Factions within the court sharpened their ambitions like blades, maneuvering to control the monarchy through her, the queen who was both prize and pawn. Whispers reached her even when no one dared speak aloud. Servants traded rumors in the shadowed corners of the palace. Nobles plotting secret treaties, bishops questioning her marriage, and distant cousins eyeing the crown itself. She learned quickly that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. Letters began arriving from France, each one laced with veiled warnings and coded pleas. Her family urged her to remain loyal, to remember her bloodline. But England had become her prison. Every step she took was watched, every word weighed. She had no allies, at least none she could rely on openly. And yet, she began to understand something vital. Silence could be her greatest weapon. While the men around her thundered and schemed, she listened. She memorized names, alliances, grudges. She noticed which lords avoided each other's gaze, which bishops met in secret after dusk, which servants passed too many messages between rival halls. Piece by piece, she assembled the map of power, tracing its paths through hidden corridors and shadowed chambers. The deeper she sank into the game, the clearer its dangers became. Beyond the palace walls, unrest boiled. Failed harvests had left villages starving, while tax collectors stripped them bare to fund the nobility's endless feasts. Rebellion brewed in whispers and flames, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the chaos reached Westminster's marble gates. Then came the winter feast, a night meant to display unity and splendor. Beneath glittering chandeliers, nobles raised their jeweled goblets, laughter echoing across the grand hall. But she could feel the tension lurking beneath the pageantry. Across the table, two powerful factions exchanged cold, measuring stares. That night, as the candles burned low, a single phrase reached her ears, murmured by a drunken lord leaning too close. "If the king falls, the girl decides the crown." For the first time, she understood the full weight of her existence. Her body, her signature, even her silence, all could decide the fate of kingdoms. She returned to her chambers and stared at her reflection, the gold of her crown gleaming in the firelight. Once she had dreamed of freedom, of running barefoot through gardens and orchards. Now there was no escape, but there was power, if she dared to take it. The girl who had arrived in England a child was gone. What remained was something sharper, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. The whispers in the corridors still called her a dove trapped in a gilded cage. What they didn't yet realize was that doves could learn to fly, and sometimes they carried fire in their wings.